Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. So first of all, apologies for being late in setting up the presentation. Now, this presentation is going to go on for about 40-45 minutes. Usually the format is I'd like to ask questions during the presentation, get some feedback. I'm going to leave that for the end because we have a lot more time. Now, the first thing I want to give a small warning, which is that this is going to be a little bit advanced if you don't have any background in this sort of area. So although we're going to cover the basics, yes, just one more. Okay.
Assalamu alaikum. We need these two cars to be moved as they are blocking the sister staff of Salif. RK06 UAH and RA14XVW. Please move your classes.
Okay, so Bismillah. So this particular lecture, if there's something you don't understand, if there's something which doesn't make sense, don't just switch off. Try to absorb as much information as you can and just keep that question for the end, because inshallah I'm going to give a lot of time for the Q&A. Now, the first thing is I'd like to share a story, something that happened to me here in Wickham a few years ago. So in 2010-11, I used to work just near the town centre, and there used to be a gaming shop near Rooster's Chicken. I'm not sure if it's still there anymore. I haven't been down to that centre for many years. But there's something which I'm not going to forget, because about 8-9 years ago, internet cafes were quite popular. People used to go to the internet cafes to use internet. We didn't have smartphones to use the internet on. You either had to use a PC or go to an internet cafe. So after work, I went to an internet cafe, and it was a gaming cafe where you have people who, buy and sell video games and second-hand stuff. And there's the game shop owner. He's a very nice guy. I used to talk to him sometimes, just about different things, nothing about religion. But just one day I just finished using the internet, so I thought I'd ask him about Islam. So to get the conversation sort of going, I just asked him a very direct question. I said, do you believe in God? Do you believe there's a creator? And by this point, this guy, he was quite friendly with me, and he'd known me for quite a few months. So he looked at me and he said, I believe in science. And he said it with so much certainty. Now, the question I asked was, do you believe in God? The answer he gave me was, I believe in science. That's kind of like saying, I ask you, are you interested in cricket? And you reply, I don't like stamp collecting. The answer was very different to the question that I asked. And one of the reasons why this sort of lecture is very important is that you get to understand that the world that we live in right now, people have certain paradigms, they have certain ways of thinking. And these paradigms are very heavily influenced by scientific rationalism. I believe in something if it's scientific, if it can be shown, if it can be tested, if it can be empirically verified. So even when it comes to the existence of God, there are people out there, there's actually a large number of people out there who are, they believe in this sort of scientism, that science is the main root of knowledge, and science is not only the main root of knowledge, science is the only way how you know something for certain. And the reason why this is important is because before you give me 40 minutes of your time, you need to know why you're actually going to bother to listen to this lecture. Because, before you do anything, you should always ask yourself, why am I doing this? What's the point of this? So one way of motivating you about the importance of this type of knowledge is that 100 years ago, something like this would have been pretty useless, right? Something like this would have been pretty useless. If I gave a talk about tazkiyah, or if I gave a talk about something else, it would be a lot more relevant. But the world is very different to 100 years ago. We live in a world where, as you know, we as Muslims, it is our duty to convey the message of Islam. And the people that we speak to, the beliefs that they hold, we need to know something about them if we're going to engage with them. And what we need to understand about people today is they are heavily influenced by this type of scientism. So the knowledge that you're going to gain today, inshallah, this is going to be very valuable. It's going to be valuable from two perspectives. It's going to be valuable from the perspective of when you're conveying Islam, you'll be able to understand the other person's paradigm and where they're coming from and how to break that down. That's the first point. The second point is, as a Muslim growing up in this country, being born and raised like most of us are here, we accidentally also adopt assumptions which are external to Islam. We adopt assumptions because we go through the schooling system, which although we maintain our iman, we still actually hold a lot of assumptions about the world and how you know and how you don't know knowledge incorrectly, because we were actually part of the system. So it has dual benefits. Now, how many people here have seen this image? Something like this, right? Now, you could go to sub-Saharan Africa and show somebody an image like this. Chances are they'll have an idea this has something to do with evolution. This has something to do with Darwin's theory, something to do with perhaps atheism. This is a well-known iconic image. Now, the reason I put this image there is because if you know nothing about Darwin's theory, even if you happen to be, say, illiterate, you just recognize that image. This particular image, as widespread as it is not the way that Darwin's theory actually works. According to philosophers of biology and according to eminent biologists, this particular image is a misrepresentation of how the theory works. Now, the reason they say this, there's several reasons for that. One is that Darwin's theory is not a theory of progression. Also, this whole idea that we came from chimpanzees is incorrect, because even according to the theory, we have a common ancestor, which with a chimpanzee-like creature, and you can go on and on. But that's not important. The science and philosophy of biology is not important at the moment. What is important is that an image that you had in your head is not correct. That's what's important. Because in this whole presentation, what you're going to realize is there is a public perception of the theory of evolution, Darwin's theory of evolution, and there is a reality. And there's a difference between the two. And this difference is not insignificant. This difference is very significant, because if a person understood Darwin's theory academically, not at a popular level, if they understood it academically, they would understand this is not a threat to, say, the belief in God, or say the purpose of life in Islam, or Islamic fundamentals. But if a person has a public understanding of the theory is a fact, the theory is beyond doubt, the theory has given certain implications which are inescapable, and XYZ, then there'll definitely be a conflict between what you think the theory is, or what you thought, what is being taught to you what the theory is, and the belief in God and Islamic fundamentals. So here's what we're going to be covering. We're going to be covering the relationship between science and certainty, the current state of Darwinian evolution, the relationship between God's existence and Darwinism, why Darwinian evolution is unique, right? And I think this is very important, because I'm not here giving you a 40-minute lecture about string theory in a masjid or general relativity. And it'll be very odd if you happen to go pray Salah in some mosque and you happen to find out that there's a lecture going on after Maghrib about Einstein's theory of relativity. You'll find that very bizarre. But we are having to talk about this theory. So there is something about this theory which makes it unique in the history and philosophy of science, which we're going to cover at the end. And a little bit we're going to be covering about Islam and science. Okay, what's important to understand about the people I'm going to be speaking about today is the people I'm going to be referencing, the journals I'm going to be using, the arguments I'm going to be using from a scientific perspective, from a conceptual and philosophical perspective. This is all from mainstream secular academics. So these aren't people who believe in God, believe in creationism or intelligent design, anything like that. And also, what's important to understand is because this particular lecture is designed for a university level audience, so I appreciate not everyone's going to be on that level, because I'm sure some of you are maybe just barely getting into your teens. You don't need to worry about that, because I'm going to give plenty of time to go over some of the concepts. So we're going to start off a little bit slow, go a little bit faster, but then we can break down those concepts when we get to the Q&A. So science, if you want to define science or define the actual methodology of science, a popular understanding is this is the way that science works. This is true and false, because from a philosophy of science point of view, there is a huge discussion about what is science, how do you demarcate science and pseudoscience, science and non-science, and all these sorts of issues that come. However, for the purposes of this particular talk, it's enough for us to understand. You start off with a question, you do some background research, you come up with a hypothesis, you test the hypothesis against evidence, and if that hypothesis is doing really well, it gets elevated to a theory. Now, what's very important is we sometimes have this idea that a scientific law or a scientific fact is greater than a scientific theory. This is not actually true. A scientific theory is the highest level of achievement you can get in science. A scientific theory may include scientific facts, scientific laws, and other scientific sub-theories, but a scientific theory or the scientific paradigm is the main product of science. Now, why is science so important in today's world? Well, it's shown that it works, and we have fans, we have lights, we have mobile phones connected to satellites. Somebody in the back may be playing Angry Birds without me knowing. We live in an interconnected world because of science. And the very fact that science works means that it is something that people start to put their hope and trust into. Because human beings, it is in our nature, it is in our fitrah to be grateful. So science has become a sort of new clergy now, because science has given us all these technologies and it works, so it has this very prestigious status. Now, just because science works doesn't mean it is true. Now, this is a very counterintuitive idea, right? Because you think if it works, it's true. However, if we look at the history and philosophy of science, we find out actually that's not the case. So the first issue in the philosophy of science is what's known as the problem of induction, or I'm going to call it the black swan problem. The black swan problem goes as follows. There's a scientist who wants to find out what color swans are. So he goes out, collects, say, 1,000 specimens, discovers all the ones that he studied are white, and then he carries on and gets another 100, another 200 and 300, and all that he can see is all the swans are actually white. So he comes up with the general conclusion using the limited set of data that all swans are white. However, one day he can come across a black swan, or somebody a few decades after him can come across a black swan and challenge the previous idea that all swans are white. So this is the problem of induction, and this is a well-known problem in the philosophy of science. The second problem is what's known as underdetermination of scientific theory by observation. Rather than having that long name, I just called it the scattergraph problem, right? Because it's the same thing. So you have a scattergraph, and I'm sure some of the younger ones here are probably doing this at school right now. So when you have something like this scattergraph, you have those green dots. Those dots represent observations, things that we know to be true, that we can physically see. And you collect all those observations, and you're asked to represent those observations using a line of best fit. Now, using this particular data, you can either make a straight line, you can make a curve, you can make an inverted line, you can come up with many different theories, many different inferences and lines of best fit using the same observations. So the problem in the philosophy of science, which I actually shouldn't call it a problem, it's one of the beauties of science that science can change because the same data can give rise to alternative interpretations, alternative histories or phylogenies in terms of evolution. Now what's interesting, and remember throughout this talk, my main takeaway message is there's a difference between the public understanding and the academic understanding. What's interesting is if you pick up The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, which was published some 150 something years ago, this is supposed to be the most important work of Darwin's life and the most important work in evolutionary biology. Darwin, right at the beginning, he mentions this problem in the philosophy of science. And he says that my theory, I have derived my theory using the facts which are in front of me. However, it is possible that somebody else can use the same facts to come up with an alternative theory which is different to mine. He says this right at the beginning of The Origin of Species. However, he goes on to say, I still believe my theory is correct. The reason why I highlighted this is to show that is not the public perception. The public perception is not that, oh, there's a set of data, so, there's many different inferences. The public perception is data is evidence and evidence points in one direction, and that's not correct. Two main reasons why science changes, although there's many others, is novel observations, so the black swan problem, and the scattergraph problem, that you can have alternative theories based on the same evidence. Another issue is the issue between realism and instrumentalism. So in the philosophy of science, there are two camps. There is the realist camp and there is the anti-realist camp. Now this doesn't have anything to do with the matrix. What this basically means is realism says science, when it's speaking about the world, it is speaking and giving us a true description of the way the world is. That's realism. So when scientific theories are describing the world, they are describing what's really out there. Anti-realism or instrumentalism is the view scientific theories we cannot say for certain are giving us truth or a true description of the world. They may be giving us a true description or it may be false. They are agnostic about the claims about the world. Now, the thing about realism and instrumentalism, both of these views are held by philosophers of science. However, both camps, realists and anti-realists, they both agree science doesn't give you absolute truth. Science still is susceptible to the problem of induction and the scattergraph problem. And there's other problems as well. But they will both agree that science can change in the future. But one camp is more stronger than the other. That camp says, when science is talking about the world, we believe the claims to be true. They can be revised, but we believe them to be true with a small t. Instrumentalists say, we can't say that. Now what's important to understand is that this is in regards to what's known as observables, unobservables, things that we cannot see. When it comes to things that we can directly see, then both of these camps would say, of course, that is something that we do believe to be true. But as I'm going to speak about later on, there's a difference between observations and scientific theories. Okay. This slide's gone a bit funky, so the last part's cut off there, but I'll explain that. There's three reasons why the realist view is a lot stronger than the anti-realist view. The first is that scientific theories, they sit in a web of other theories. The second is that each scientific theory has unconceived alternatives and unconceived entities within that theory. And the last is that there is theoretical conservatism within science today, which didn't exist, say, 150 years ago, which is why science is quite rigid. Now, each one of these areas, this is something which you find papers that philosophers of science write about. For example, a prominent figure is Kyle Stanford, and he's a philosopher of science, and he makes the argument that because of unconceived alternatives and theories and the theoretical conservatism in science, that science, it makes more sense for us to be anti-realist than realists. Now, as Muslims, what's important for us to understand is that when we go and speak about this particular issue, if we get to that point, we don't need to say, we as Muslims believe this or we as Muslims believe that. And we are different to everybody else in terms of this question. We can say whether you're a Muslim or you're not a Muslim, whether you're an atheist, a Jew, a Christian, whoever, the philosophy of science still says the same thing, which is that science doesn't give you truth, and science at best, you should be agnostic about the claims that it actually makes about the world. And this is important because sometimes when you challenge the popular narrative, the claim that some people will make against you is you're only making those comments because you're Muslim. But the fact of the matter is that these points here are independent of whatever belief you hold. You could be from any religious background, these beliefs are independent. These conclusions are independent. Now, obviously, what doesn't change is direct observations. So we know the shape of the earth, we know water is H2O, we know fossils exist, and we know DNA is a code. But there's a difference between observations and science. Observations existed obviously before science, and people were using observations to come up with pseudoscience, and today we use observations to come up with science. For example, using stars, you can come up with astronomy. Using stars, you can come up with astrology. Are both of these science? No. One of them is a valid science, one of them is palm reading and astrology, and it's all those sorts of superstitious beliefs. But they both use the existence of stars. So observations are very different to science. And observations we can say we know to be true, literally, but scientific theory is theories that use the observations, we cannot say that they have the same epistemic weight. And the thing is, scientific theories can change even if they work really, really well. Now, Newton's model of the universe, it was very powerful. If you made a prediction, where is this planet going to be in 6 months from now, and you were to go out and look for that planet, you will see it is there according to Newton's laws. However, although Newton's theory worked well for 200 years and was confirmed again and again, Einstein came along at the beginning of the 20th century and he made a complete paradigm shift on the Newtonian worldview. The way gravity worked changed, the definition of mass changed, time and space was no longer fixed but was flexible. So today, even today, Newton's laws work, but the fundamental model of the universe that Newton based his laws on has been completely revised. So scientific theories, even if they work well for over 200 years like Newton's theory did, it doesn't mean it's true. Working well doesn't mean true. Working well means it works. Theories work even when they turned out to be false. Even after they turned out to be false. So for example, chemists used to have this theory called phlogiston. Phlogiston turned out to be false, but it helped us discover nitrogen, which is an element. Nitrogen obviously exists and we still use it today. But the theory that was used to discover nitrogen turned out to be false. And likewise, we know that Newton's model of the universe is not correct. However, we can still go to space based upon Newtonian laws. Okay. Scientific theories work even when they contradict each other. So today, in physics, we have the general theory of relativity and we have the quantum theory. Both of these contradict at a fundamental level, yet they both make precise predictions which are confirmed. Scientists don't say, I'm going to reject this one, accept this one, reject this one. They say, they both work, we're going to accept both of them. Yet fundamentally, they both can't be true because they have different entities that they posit about the world. If you pick up a basic book on the philosophy of science, and I'm talking about introductory level, I'm not even speaking about advanced level, it's going to say something like this. For example, this is a very short introduction to the philosophy of science by Oxford University. Historically, there are many cases of theories that we now believe to be false, but that were empirically quite successful. So being successful as a theory doesn't mean it's true. It just means it's successful. And why is this the case? Because we know even false theories can turn out to be sometimes more powerful than theories which are more accurate. So being successful empirically in terms of science doesn't mean it's true. The picture here is of Larry Loden. He is a philosopher of science, and he's written a landmark paper in which he gets very successful empirically verified theories which worked well for a long time but then turned out to be false. So you do have mainstream philosophers of science who you can easily find who believe that scientific theories can be revised. And this is the mainstream view in academia. And this is totally different to the popular view. The popular view is science is the way, the truth, and the life. But the academic view is science is a pragmatic tool for us to apply reason to the natural world. Again, in another more advanced book on the philosophy of science, again by Oxford University, it says this: science is revisable. Hence, to talk of scientific proof is dangerous, because the term fosters the idea of conclusions that are graven in stone. Now look at that word proof. My daughter, she watches this program called Peter Rabbit, right? Now in Peter Rabbit, you get these rabbits and they're like running around and doing all these sort of stuff. And in one of the episodes, one of the rabbits says, well, there's no scientific proof for that. And you know, it's not just an off-the-cuff remark. You'll find this in popular media, you'll find this in popular books, you'll find this in popular documentaries. You find this type of narrative. This is proof, this is true, this is a fact. Just a few years ago, I was watching a video of David Attenborough. He was speaking about this fossil called Ida. And he gave this very impassioned speech. And you know, like the Prophet ﷺ said, some speech is sihr. Yeah? So David Attenborough, I believe he has some of that, yeah? And he's giving this passionate speech about why people don't believe in evolution, and they speak about the missing link. Well, we've found this, the missing link is no longer missing. And he gave this really powerful, passionate speech and said, look, we have the fossil. We even know what food that fossil ate before it died. It's the most well-preserved fossil that we had. And da-da-da-da-da. He just went on and on. I don't remember exactly what he said, but it was very powerful. Only 2 years later, that fossil turned out to be completely false. Not that it was forged, but the inference that was made using that fossil, that it was this amazing missing link that, you know, had been missing for 150 or so years, it actually turned out that that wasn't the case, and it was quite embarrassing for the people who were actually making this claim. However, the documentary about Ida, that fossil, this went on channel, channel 4 or BBC, one of these main channels, translated to many different languages. There was a book, there was a documentary. In fact, today, if you put Ida fossil in Google, I believe you're going to get at least 1 million searches. Something like this, right? 1 million results. It's crazy. However, the fact that this fossil turned out to be false, the level of noise that was made from the atheist community was like a blip compared to the massive amount of noise that was being made about Ida in 2009, when it was supposed to be the greatest thing since sliced bread. And what's interesting is even the most hardcore proponents of Darwinian evolution, like the Oxford Professor Richard Dawkins, who is an avid vocal atheist activist, when push comes to shove, and when they have to speak the way that academics have to speak, they will use language like this. Rather than saying it's a fact, it's true, you've got to be insane not to believe in it, only religious fools reject it, This is in one of his lesser known works, A Devil's Chaplain. He says, "We must acknowledge the possibility that new facts may come to light which will force our successors of the 21st century to abandon Darwinism or modify it beyond recognition." Now, that's obviously very different to anybody who's seen the other stuff that Richard Dawkins writes about, or in his other very popular book, The God Delusion. Very different narrative, very different sort of level of certainty that he's actually speaking about. Now, this thing that he's raising, he's speaking about the black swan problem, or the problem of induction. However, when he was asked about this very issue of the problem of induction, he gave an answer which was not exactly this answer to a public audience. So we have to understand that these people who push out these narratives, they do actually have an agenda. And it's not just me as a Muslim with a beard saying, oh yeah, these guys have an agenda. If you look at the most popular atheist book in the world is The God Delusion. That's the most popular atheist book in the world. It is the most, not only popular atheist book, it's the most popular book about evolution as well. It's been translated into many different languages, and it's been, translated and given out, and it's become a landmark feature. However, the authority in Darwinian evolution, in the history of biology, in the history of Darwinian accounts, is Michael Ruse. Michael Ruse is an atheist philosopher of science. He himself is a Darwinist. He does believe in Darwin's theory. However, what he said, and remember he's an atheist, what he said about Richard Dawkins' book is he said, reading that book made me embarrassed to be an atheist. Yeah? That's quite a statement. Reading that book made me embarrassed to be an atheist. Now, why is he saying that? That's because when you have books like The God Delusion, they don't represent what mainstream academia actually teaches about Darwin's theory. And we're going to get into just one of the statements that Dawkins makes later on and why that statement is false. Now, Darwin's theory, although it's been promoted as a fact, it's true, you've got to be an idiot to deny it, only religious people deny it. The first point to understand is if you know nothing about Darwin's theory, just knowing what we covered so far about the philosophy of science, the problem of induction, the underdetermination of theory by evidence, scattergraph problem, realism, anti-realism, theoretical conservatism in science, what's the other thing I mentioned? The other stuff which I mentioned, right? All those issues in the philosophy of science. We would know nothing in science can give you certainty, right? Science doesn't give you certainty. Science gives you scientific theories which work, which are useful, and then they are rejected, not rejected, I should rather say replaced, and with newer, better models. That's about it. But to go beyond that and say science has given us proof, science has given us facts, science has given us these things which are immutable, which are unchangeable, which are absolute, this is all propaganda. This is all the popular understanding. This is not the academic understanding of science, and neither of Darwin's theory. Now, there's three things about Darwin's theory which are inescapable, apart from the philosophy of science. The three things are this. Before I get to them, let me just give you the sort of narrative which I've heard myself, which is not something like I'm making a straw man of what they say. This is actually what I've heard myself. They would say something like this. Say there's a professor and he's giving a lecture to a university audience. He would say, whether you look at biochemistry, whether you look at genetics, you look at anatomy, you look at bioinformatics, you look at linguistics, you look at psychology, you look at biogeography, or you look at the fossil record, whatever you look at, all of these subfields of biology, they converge towards one conclusion, which is Darwin was right. This is the narrative that's being pushed out there. And alongside that narrative, you also have that narrative that because we have a naturalistic explanation, there is no God. You get both of these. You get the narrative that it's all worked out, it's all true, and the second thing is, this shows that there's no God. Both of these, not from an Islamic point of view, but from an academic point of view, are false. Both of these are popular propaganda which we've been primed to believe. There's three things about Darwin's theory which are inescapable. It's based on a probabilistic framework, there are assumptions involved, and there are disputes till today about most fundamental ideas. Now, sometimes you hear these statistics which are thrown around. 99% of scientists believe in Darwin's theory. Okay, say that's true. Say we accept it at face value. That doesn't mean they believe it to be literally true. It means they believe it to be a valid scientific theory. Now, Darwin's theory is a valid scientific theory. However, being a valid scientific theory doesn't mean it's true. It just means it's a valid scientific theory. So, when someone says 99% of biologists or 99% of philosophers or whatever, they believe in it, well, we need to ask, what do they believe? Because they obviously believe it's valid. They don't believe it's literally true. Okay. The first thing we need to do is make a distinction between evolution and Darwinian evolution. Now, as I've been mentioning throughout, there's a difference between the public understanding and the academic understanding. The public understanding is evolution, Darwinism, Darwinian evolution, neo-Darwinism, it's all the same. Right? It's all just one big biryani. No. From an academic point of view, evolution is different to Darwinian evolution because evolution has been written about, philosophized about, theorized about for at least 3,000 years of human history. We have accounts going back to the ancient Brahmins, the ancient Greeks, the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Babylonians, speaking about biological change over time, which is what evolution is. Evolution in its most basic format simply means biological change over time, which even the ancients knew about, which is theologically not toxic, which is theologically not dangerous. Darwin's theory is radically different. 50 years before Darwin, roughly, there's a French biologist called Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And he came up with this idea that there's many different origins of life and there's parallel lines of evolution which is taking place because of this mechanism of acquired characteristics. So he had his own theory. Darwin came along and he said there's not multiple origins of life, there's one origin of life, and this is happening because of natural selection. Now, you may not understand the sciences between Lamarck and Darwin and what happened before. But all you need to understand for the purposes of this lecture is evolution as a basic concept is totally different to Darwinian evolution. These two are not the same thing. The reason why it's important to make this distinction is evolution is true. We know evolution happens and it's indisputable. Darwinian evolution, you cannot give it that same epistemic weight. You can't say it's true literally. You can't say it's undeniable. However, if somebody thinks they're both the same thing, then evidence for this becomes evidence for that, which is a sleight of hand, which is a fallacy of equivocation, which is obviously not the right way of doing things, but that's often used to convince people of Darwin's theory. When they ask for evidence for Darwin's theory, they're given evidence just for biological evolution, which is, like I mentioned, trivial. Now, working out the history of life on Earth is incredibly difficult. Working out the history of High Wycombe for the last, say, 600 years would be pretty difficult. But when it comes to working out the history of life on Earth, we are speaking about a problem which is tremendous, which is hard to even fathom. Just consider this. According to a statistic by the National Science Foundation, 99.999% of species that ever existed do no longer exist, and we do not have their DNA, and we do not have their fossils, and we do not have a shred of evidence of their existence. What that basically means is on Earth today, everything that we have, including the life which is alive, which is about 1 trillion species, in the history of the world, we had about 1 trillion species. Everything that is alive today, and all the fossils that we have for the dinosaurs and everything else, we have 0.0001%. That's the level, that's if we study everything, which we haven't studied, right? Most of the ocean life hasn't been studied. Most of the life in terms of fossils hasn't been discovered yet. However, even if we did all of that, we're speaking about 0.0001% of all life on Earth, right, is still preserved in some form, whether it's alive or it's a fossil or it's a DNA or whatever. If we're going to work out this history, it's bound to be probabilistic because of the level of information that is missing. Now, to make the problem even more difficult, is that we're not speaking about something which happened 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 5,000 years ago. We're speaking about an estimated history of life on Earth for about 4 billion years. So to work out the history of life is incredibly difficult. It's really, really difficult, because how are you going to test out those sort of ideas? I'm not saying we shouldn't, we should give up, but it is incredibly difficult to do that. So one of the metaphors that's used in a scientific journal is in the journals known as Science, which is the second most prestigious journal in the world, and it gives the history of working out the history of human life on Earth. It says it's like trying to work out the plot of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace with 13 randomly selected pages and all the rest of the pages are blank. That's a metaphor which is there to try and capture what is very difficult to fathom, which is the history is so in the remote past, and the amount of data that's missing. This metaphor is a good way of remembering what we're actually dealing with. So it's like a scatter graph on steroids. It is a far greater problem than you would have in other scientific theories which don't go back so far. And you can make many different inferences using the same data. You can say there's multiple origins of life like Lamarck believed in, or you can say it's universal common ancestry, you can say it's gradualism or it's rapid change, there's some level of progression going on or there's non-progression. Whatever you make, whatever inference you make is still based on what philosophers of science call auxiliary assumptions. And those auxiliary assumptions, those are not based on science. Those are philosophical assumptions. Those are non-scientific assumptions. So this whole thing of we just believe in science, there's no philosophy behind the science. There's no assumptions behind the science. There's no, it's just evidence. This is a very primitive, popular narrative, but this isn't actually the way academia works. Some biologists, they are very adamant about the sort of problems that we actually have in terms of the public understanding and the academic understanding. Now, when you look at a complex trait like the eye, when you look at, say, speech, or you look at, various functions of the body which are incredible, like our kidneys, and like there's a part of our brain that does chemical testing. When you look at all these types of things, how did this come about? If you watch a documentary or if you read a scientific book on this, it will give you this scenario, well, when we used to be in the caves, this happened or that happened, and this thing, and this evolved because of this evolutionary pressure. However, these are scenarios. These are hypothetical possibilities. But a hypothetical possibility doesn't mean it actually happened. So if you come up with a coherent, plausible story, it doesn't mean that actually happened. And some biologists, like Richard Lewontin, who is an atheist, who is from Harvard University, he says these types of accounts which are very popular, which we've all grown up with, how did this evolve? It evolved because of that. How did this evolve? It evolved because of that. He says these are just so stories. Just so stories, if you're not old enough to remember. I don't think kids know about this book now, but it used to in my days. These are, for example, how did the elephant get a long trunk? Well, the alligator was dragging it into the water and it got longer and longer and longer. Basically, nonsensical stories that you tell children. So Richard Lewontin is saying those popular accounts which are in documentaries, which are in textbooks, which are shown to be evidence, They are just plausible stories, but we don't have a shred of evidence for them. Right? They are just so stories. Now, of course, Richard Lewington doesn't represent the views of all biologists. But the reason why I'm mentioning him is to show you that there is dispute. There is people out there who are openly saying this is not the way that the public should be taught this theory. Another very basic way that we are taught biological evolution is, hey, look at that, they look similar, so they have a common ancestor. That's a very primitive way that you will, I'm sure if you've seen Blue Planet, or if you've seen other documentaries where it talks about similar, actually not Blue Planet, but other documentaries where it does speak about evolution, it says, well, this is similar to this, therefore they have a common ancestor. This gene is similar to this gene, therefore common ancestor. This bone is similar to this bone, therefore common ancestor. However, homology, which is the assumption that two things which are similar either anatomically or genetically, therefore they have a common ancestor, the first point is simply an assumption. It's nothing more than an assumption. You cannot say it's true literally. If you try and say it's true literally, you're going to commit the fallacy of circular reasoning. So, two things. They have a common ancestor. These two, homology is the idea that two things, if two things are similar, they have a common ancestor. Therefore, this thing does have a common ancestor. The problem with the first premise and the second premise and the conclusion is that the conclusion is the same as the first premise. Right? So if you're to put this in a deductive form, hey, look, similarity, hey, look, similarity. That's the first premise. Second, similarities is due to common descent. Conclusion, similarities is due to common descent. So you cannot claim that homology is true literally. You can just leave it as an assumption. However, the assumption of homology is challenged by what's known as homoplasy, which is that there are similarities at a genetic level and at a physical level between different organisms, which is not due to common ancestry, even according to biologists and evolutionary thinkers. It is just simply not. Even detailed biochemical identical structures, they evolved independently, even according to them. So again, that's a popular narrative which is also false. Another very popular narrative is humans and chimps, they have a common ancestor. And this is true literally. It's not based on a probabilistic framework, there's no assumptions involved, there's nothing going on, it's just true. However, if you pick up a book on the philosophy of biology, like Evidence in Evolution, which is published by Cambridge University, it will give you a different paradigm. For example, it says about human-chimp ancestry, both of the following thoughts are naive. Humans and chimps must share a common ancestor because they're so similar, and humans and mushrooms must have arisen independently because they're so different. Within a probabilistic framework, there is no must in either case. The important thing here is they acknowledge there are probabilities involved and there's the assumption of homology. It's not just simply the case of, hey, look at that, therefore common ancestor. You have to remember something very important. Similarities between different creatures were known and written about before Darwin. The fact that there's a similarity between a human being and a pig, and a human being and a chimp, and a human being and a daffodil is not controversial. It was known before. Darwin's theory took off because he gave a mechanism, which was natural selection. So it's not enough to say similarities, therefore common ancestor. You need to provide a mechanism, which Darwin did. However, as we're going to see later on, the mechanism is not something which is indisputable. It actually does have opponents, and there are very good reasons to actually doubt it. So this whole idea of, look, we're similar to chimps, so therefore we have a common ancestor with chimps, and it's definitely the case. This is again a popular narrative which misrepresents the academic understanding of the theory. Now, what's interesting is when you look at human sociological behavior, we're not actually similar to the chimpanzee, we're actually way more similar to ants. Ants have large colonies in which they live in millions, they have mega cities, they have warfare, they have battlefield medicine, they have economies, they have slaves, they have market. They have all this sophisticated social interaction and hierarchy, and even they have laws of treason, right? Chimps do not have that sophisticated social society, but human beings do. In terms of language, we're far more closer to songbirds than we are to chimpanzees. In terms of intelligence, the closest species to the human being is not the chimpanzee, it's actually the crow. Okay, Darwin's theory also has assumptions. These are scientific assumptions, and obviously outside of the science, they are philosophical assumptions to the theory. So natural selection obviously being the driving force, genes transmitting vertically, the selfish gene view, gradualism, and acquired characteristics are not inherited, mutations are random. This isn't a biology class. But all I want you to understand is, the way the theory is projected is, it's true. You've got to be an idiot to deny it. But when you look at it academically, there are assumptions involved, and as we're going to see, those assumptions are being challenged. Now, there are people out there who want to challenge Darwin's theory with alternatives. Now, those alternatives, they are there to explain what Darwin's theory supposedly cannot. 3 of those alternatives are evolution by natural genetic engineering, neo-Lamarckian evolution, and mutation-driven evolution. Now, you may not understand the sciences, but the important point to understand is there are evolutionary biologists who say this data cannot be explained by Darwin, therefore I'm going to try and bring up an alternative to explain it. And remember, the people who put forward these alternatives are not religiously driven. These are people who still believe in the tree of life and human chimpanzee history and all the rest. They deny the mechanism and they challenge Darwin head on. There's also a project known as the Third Way of Evolution, in which evolutionary biologists from across the world, they don't deny, say, the tree of life, but they deny Darwin's mechanism and they challenge natural selection. What's interesting is natural selection is, remember, Darwin's main thesis. That's the main thesis in The Origin of Species. So it's not an indisputable fact, even amongst evolutionary biologists. Now, as we're coming to the last section, we're going to start to see, if you remember going back to my initial slides, I said I'm not giving you guys a talk about general relativity or about string theory, but I am giving you a talk about Darwin's theory. Why is that? And that's because Darwin's theory is unique in the history of science, is unique in the philosophy of science, not for a good reason. And that is because Darwin's theory is mixing oil and water. It's mixing good science with bad theology. And when I say Darwin's theory, I'm speaking about the public perception which is being pushed out by the likes of Richard Dawkins. That's what I mean by Darwin's theory in this context. So the first point we need to understand is that there is a background assumption of naturalism, which is the idea that everything can be explained naturalistically. Now, the same biologist who I mentioned before, I'm just going to read out a quotation from him about naturalism and why this is important in context of evolutionary theory. We are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes. A priori meaning before experience. We are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So, naturalism, this idea that there is no God, everything can be explained naturalistically, this is not a conclusion in science. This is an assumption in science. And it's important to differentiate the two. Because sometimes, because of the popular narrative, we confuse an assumption with a conclusion. Oh, if God exists, why doesn't biology textbooks mention God? Well, we have the assumption of naturalism, which is we will not explain anything using any tools other than natural tools of causes and effects. Also, what we need to understand is Darwin's theory, although it's a valid scientific theory, model paradigm, it also has a darker side. And it has a darker side not according to myself, although I do believe it has a darker side, according to proponents of the theory and opponents of the theory who are both atheists. This is very important to understand. It has another dimension to it other than a scientific dimension, which general relativity doesn't have, which string theory doesn't have, according to proponents and opponents of the theory. So let me mention the proponents. The handsome guy in black and white, that's Julian Huxley. He was an atheist philosopher and an evolutionary biologist. He believed Darwin's theory to be true, and he believed Darwin's theory was a valid scientific theory. However, he also believed Darwin's theory was also a religion. He wrote a book in the 20s or 40s, I don't remember. The book is called Religion Without Revelation. Religion without revelation. Now obviously we as Muslims, we believe revelation. We believe Allah sends revelation. But here Julian Huxley is saying there is a religion without revelation. It didn't come from God, but it is a religion. It is a way of life. And this religion, according to him, was Darwinism, was evolutionary humanism. He believed this was a religion, and he believed this religion, it needed to be propagated all over the world. I just want you to understand that statement, because not only was he a very prominent biologist, if you Google him, you'll find that he was a very important evolutionary biologist. However, it's not just that he was an evolutionary biologist and an atheist philosopher. He was also the founding president of UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. UNESCO. How many members of the UN? Every country in the world, maybe except Somaliland. Every country in the world. UNESCO is the department which deals with education. And the founding president of UNESCO is Julian Huxley, who says, not only is there no God, not only do we need to evangelize there's no God, he also says evolutionary theory is a religion and we need to propagate it to the world, and he happened to be in the most strategically important position to propagate that view. Decades after he was in that position, we have gone through his system. The Western education system, and even the education system in the East, it is heavily influenced. I'm not talking about indirectly, directly by evolutionary humanism. And that is primarily because of the works of Julian Huxley. Okay. The next handsome chap up there is Richard Dawkins. Now Richard Dawkins, in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, he says, Darwin allowed us to be intellectually satisfied atheists. That's a very significant statement. That's a very powerful statement if you think about it. You wouldn't find a Buddhist saying, general relativity made me an intellectually fulfilled Buddhist. You will not find that. But you find here a person linking his belief in atheism to a scientific theory. So clearly, if you believe a scientific theory supports your worldview, the way you treat that theory is going to be very different to if you believe that theory is theologically neutral, or it has no impact on your worldview. What's interesting about Richard Dawkins' statement, which he repeats in The God Delusion in a different way, which he repeats in his lectures, in his talks, and in all of his public avenues, is Darwin would have disagreed with Richard Dawkins. That's what's so powerful. Charles Darwin said, in my most extreme fluctuations, I was never an atheist. Darwin, when he wrote The Origin of Species, when he published The Origin of Species, he was a believer in God. He was not a Christian, but he was a deist. He believed there was a creator, but the creator did not interact with mankind. He did not believe in revelation, but he believed in God after even the publication of The Origin of Species. Later on in life, he became agnostic because of the problem of evil. Also, one of his problems was qadr. He really found it difficult. How can we have free will, and how can God know everything? However, even when he became an agnostic in the last decade of his life, he said, my beliefs are independent of my theory. My theory doesn't justify atheism. My theory doesn't give credence to atheism or theism or anything else. It is theologically neutral. He was explicitly clear about that. So he would have completely disagreed with Richard Dawkins. Lastly, there's Michael Ruse. Michael Ruse is, like I mentioned before, the most authoritative person you can imagine in the field today. The amount of books he's written about Darwinism, he's a prominent atheist, but what I like about him is he's an honest atheist. So after reading The God Delusion, he said, this book made me embarrassed to be an atheist. But not only did he say that, a few years later, he published a landmark book. The book is called Darwinism as Religion. In this book, Michael Ruse says, I believe Darwin's theory is a valid scientific theory. I believe it to be the best model to explain biological change. He himself is an atheist. He makes it clear that he subscribes to it. However, he says, what cannot be denied is from the very beginning till today, Darwin's theory is not only a scientific theory, there is another dimension to it. It is also an alternative to traditional religion. It is a religion in of itself. And this isn't, like I mentioned, he's a very prominent academic, and his book is published by Oxford University. This book, Darwinism as Religion. So, if you want to know why is there a difference between the public understanding and the academic understanding, it's because it's not just a scientific theory. It's because it is way more than a scientific theory. It is, for them, the way, the truth, and the life. Now, just before we end, it's important to mention a few things, and I have a few last slides about naturalism and scientism and our epistemology as Muslims. This isn't directly related to the topic of evolution and atheism, but it is very important to understand those topics, that we have a holistic understanding of why we as Muslims, our view as Muslims when it comes to these issues. So there's two types of naturalism. There's philosophical naturalism and there's methodological naturalism. Philosophical naturalism is the idea nature is the only thing out there. There's no God, there's nothing supernatural, there's no consciousness, there's no immaterial mind. It's all nature. So philosophical naturalism is clearly atheistic. However, methodological naturalism is not. Methodological naturalism means, for the purposes of doing science, we're only going to invoke physical causation. Outside of that, whether you believe in God or not, that's your business. But in science, we're going to use the criteria of what's observable and use causes and effects and explain everything naturalistically. As Muslims, we can accept the latter, we cannot accept the former. We can accept methodological naturalism, we cannot accept philosophical naturalism. However, the atheist evangelism movement, they promote the idea that philosophical naturalism and methodological naturalism is the same thing. It's the same thing. And that's very dangerous. We know Methodological naturalism is valid. Philosophical naturalism is not valid, and it's not a conclusion in science. It is an assumption that atheists make. Now, I mentioned right in the beginning the problem of scientism with the guy that I asked him, do you believe in God? He said, I believe in science. There's two problems that scientism, and by the way, scientism is the idea that science is the only root of knowledge, right? It's the only way we know things to be true, and science gives us certainty. It's this excessive belief in science. So this term, scientism, isn't a term I just came up with. This is an academic term that's used for this very strange phenomena we have in the 21st century, that people literally worship science. And people literally believe and have tawakkul and hope in science. They actually, when someone says, I believe in science, it's not just metaphorical. They actually believe it. The problem with scientism is it is incoherent. It is incoherent. It doesn't make sense. Why it doesn't make sense is this. Human behavior is driven by morals. However, morality is something science cannot explain. It can explain it away as an evolutionary outcome. It cannot explain the foundation. If you see a child that's poor and starving on TV, you feel empathy towards that child. There's no scientific evidence that morality between you and them exists. But morality is clearly something that human beings believe in. So if you say I only believe in science, then you have to reject the existence of morals, which drives the majority of human behavior. Mathematics is used within science. However, science cannot prove mathematics. So if you say I only believe in science, you have to throw away maths. Likewise, we do introspection. And introspection is even part of the scientific method. However, you need that before you do the science. So if someone says, I only believe in science, then you're denying even your own rational cognitive faculties. Metaphysics. I believe you have a mind. I believe the world is real. I believe the world wasn't created 5 minutes ago with the impression of being billions of years ago. Metaphysical beliefs are clearly something which are not scientific. They are outside of the scientific paradigm. For example, scientists believe fundamentally in the uniformity of nature. The way the world is now, it will carry on being. What we've seen a pattern now, this pattern we'll see in the future. That's the basis from which they make scientific inferences. However, that is a metaphysical belief that the nature is uniform. Logic, deductive, inductive, logic itself cannot be proven using science. Science needs logic. Values. I have a value that I want to follow truth. Science cannot measure values. But again, values is something which drives human beings. Testimony. Testimony accounts for the vast majority of the beliefs that we hold. How do I know my mother is my mother? It's not because of scientific evidence. It's because she told me, and somebody else told me. Majority of human knowledge is based on testimony. Even scientists. A scientist would only do so little science in their life. The majority of the beliefs they hold about other fields is based on testimony. There is a difference, however. We do believe as human beings that there's many different ways of looking at the world. It's not just about science. So we believe in morals, we believe in maths, we believe in introspection, we believe in metaphysics, logic, values, testimony. However, as Muslims, we have an additional item in our toolkit, and that is the fitrah. That is that we know deep down inside that there is a creator. This is something which we have additionally to somebody who says, I only believe in science, or I only believe in this, or I only believe in that. Lastly, the statement, I only believe in science, or I believe in science, or science is the only way of truth. Write down those statements. Whoever says them to you, get them to write it down. Then show it to them and tell them, test this statement scientifically. You cannot test it scientifically. So your very statement, I believe in science, is an unscientific statement. It's a philosophical commitment. It's incoherent. It's like saying there is no sentence, this sentence is only 2 words. It's an incoherent proposition. There is a clear difference between Islam and Darwinism. I'm not talking about the scientifically valid theory, which we as Muslims can accept as valid, but not accept to be literally true. They are both competing worldviews. So, we get this false dichotomy. It's religion versus science. It's ignorance versus rationality. Actually, no, it's not. In this context, Darwinism is a religion and Islam is a religion. And it's very important to understand this. When we're dealing, and like I mentioned at the beginning, it is the job of the Muslim community to convey the message of Islam. What we need to understand, it's not just the hardcore atheists or these types of people who believe that, science is the only root of knowledge, or the highest rationale for our existence is survival and reproduction. I mean, look, Richard Dawkins in his book, The Selfish Gene, he's giving people a purpose of life. He's telling them there is no higher rationale to life than survival and reproduction. But Islam says no. Islam says we were created to worship Allah. That is the purpose of life. So both of these are competing worldviews. It's not just the case of one is science and one is irrational superstition. We as Muslims, we can accept the science. However, what we will not accept is the religion of Darwinism, the religion of evolutionary humanism. So, in this lecture, I have covered the relationship between science and certainty, the current state of Darwinian evolution, that it's not a fact, it's not absolutely true, it is something based on a probabilistic framework which has assumptions, there are disputes, and why Darwinism is unique. Why Darwinism is unique in the history of science and philosophy. Because it's not just a scientific theory, it is also a religion. And as we know, as Allah promises in the Qur'an 3 times, it is He who sent His messenger with guidance and the religion of truth so that it may prevail over all religion. And enough is Allah as a witness. And another time it says, even though the disbelievers hate it. We know that Islam as a religion, this is the religion which is the truth, and for it to prevail intellectually, all we need is a free market. All we need is a free market of ideas, and we can show you that Islam is true, and what other philosophies teach is against the fitrah of human beings, which will never go away, which is why Islam will always prevail. And what I want you to understand is this. It is very important for us to understand, we in the West as Muslims, we do not live in a bubble. We are not in Baghdad or Islamabad or Cairo. These ideas and these philosophies, they not only affect our children and our youth, and maybe some of us here. And it's not only our job to educate ourselves, to vaccinate ourselves against the false propaganda. It is also our duty to save other people around us who the only reason they may not become Muslim is because they are affected by this propaganda. Just recently, and I found this really powerful, I had an email conversation with a sister who became Muslim some 10 years ago. And she was studying evolutionary anthropology, so the history of human beings. And she was doing a master's in evolutionary anthropology. And she was an atheist. And she firmly believed that you cannot be someone who believes in science and you cannot be somebody who believes in religion. This was her firm conviction. Yet it just took one person over a series of a few small conversations to convince them of Islam. Now what's interesting is when I was speaking to the brother who spoke to this sister who accepted Islam, none of this was invoked. None of this was invoked because that brother didn't have that knowledge. But what he did do is speak to her about Islam, and as we know, Islam is the religion of the fitrah. and the fitrah doesn't go away, even a kafir, even a mushrik, even an atheist, when they're on a ship and they have waves coming in and they think they're going to die, the fitrah comes out and they profess belief in God. So Islam as a religion is a religion of the fitrah. I've covered a lot today. But if you're overwhelmed by that, then still that shouldn't stop you from conveying the message of Islam. Because what you say, remember, since Islam is a religion of fitrah, it could awaken something within somebody, and that person could end up being Muslim. And I got really, really happy to come to High Wycombe because, mashallah, I used to come here many years ago. Brother James, who many of you know, the first time I met him, he was sitting at the back of the masjid, right, for Jummah and not praying, and he looked Turkish or something. So I thought, I don't know why this guy's not praying. He's a non-Muslim, or I thought he may have been a Muslim. And today he's Muslim. And it didn't take much. It just takes a bit of conversation. It just takes a bit of your time. But it changes somebody's life. And we're Muslim today because somebody gave dawah to our ancestors. So if we do not convey the message of Islam, then we're essentially being selfish. Because somebody gave dawah to our ancestors, but if we don't pass it on, then we're not doing something that, that is the reason why we became Muslim today. So everything good I've said is from Allah, every mistake is my own. Jazakallah khair for listening. So now is the most important part, the Q&A. So I look forward to your questions. Raise your hands and let's begin.
In the field of dawah, there's many kind of topics that are covered.
Yep.
There was a period where science was very prominent. That's kind of died down now.
Yep.
But the topic of Darwinism, evolution, it's been very quiet. I've only really found very, very limited people talking about it, one of them being yourself. To you, what do you think the main reason is that Muslims, academic Muslims, they don't make enough effort to make this knowledge widespread? It's fairly new knowledge, but it still has been around for a while, and I guess the scientific scene within kind of evolution is always changing. But even then, there's not really much information around there that dais, for example, can use to kind of explain to people why the theory of evolution is wrong. Why
Sure.
do you think that is?
So what I would say is generally, if you look at the Muslim community in terms of science, we're far behind the rest of the world. If you were to look at the West and the scientific publications in the West and all the things that are being published and written about and discoveries, we're not even a fragment of that. So we're not educated about this. But why this is now starting to become more prominent is for two reasons. One, as Muslims have settled in the West and as they've grown up here, they've come across these issues which they didn't in the Islamic world. And they've come across these sort of doubts which did not exist before. So they had to formulate answers for that. And the second reason is, as many people involved in dawah would know, the last maybe last 30 years, there's been a revival of dawah around the world. And before, the dawah used to be a lot more focused on Christianity, with Sheikh Ahmad and all the rest. But now, people are starting to realize, actually, there's not that many Christians in the West. There's a lot of people who are atheist and agnostic. So these tools had to be developed to speak to that audience. Now, I'm a firm believer that to convey the message of Islam, even to a hardcore militant atheist Darwinist, you still don't need this. I really truly believe that. Because Islam is a religion of fitrah, even giving them a few verses of the Qur'an can change their life. And wallahi, I know of people who are militant atheists who became Muslim, and when you look at the reasons why they became Muslim, it wasn't some intellectual algorithm which was fed to them. It's the religion of the fitrah which will wake them up. Yeah? But as a community, we need to prepare ourselves for this. Not only because we want to advance Islam, but also because these ideas can really confuse young Muslims. And the sad thing is, and this is really strange, when I speak to young Muslims who are confused about this, they don't understand it at all. So I try to understand why they're confused about something they don't understand. And I realize it's purely a social thing. They're having doubts because they think they should be having doubts. Does that make any sense? It doesn't. But that's what happens. They doubt Islam because of this, not because they understand the theory or the philosophy behind it, but because they think they should be doubting, because that's the narrative they should be doubting. And it just shows you the power of the fact that we're social creatures. We like to have conformity. I mean, I don't know if you know, but there's a whole case of Muslim students at a certain university students, Muslim university students, who were studying biology, would walk out of class when they were speaking about human evolution. Right? Because they think, okay, that's it, my iman's going to go if I hear about this. Like, they don't even look at the evidence. And I work with Muslims who have studied this topic, some in biochemistry, some in genetics and all the rest. These are people who actually understand it. They don't have an issue with it because they understand the assumptions behind it, the philosophy behind it. But there's so much fear that some Muslim students don't even get into that. They're just so scared of losing their iman that they don't even, although they're doing biology at university, they'll rather walk out the class. Now, of course, I'm not saying that everything they teach, they're giving you all the views. They're not. You're going to have to do your own research to understand, more in depth about the assumptions which are hidden, which other academics speak about. But it is such a powerful drive, this atheist evangelism which is happening, that we have to develop these tools and these trainings and these things to counteract that, because we literally have no choice. That's my answer to your question, why it's become more prominent. Yeah?
Any sisters have a question? Raise your hand.
Yes, Amjad Bhai.
You said that Darwinism is a valid theory, but it's not true. Is that what you're saying?
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Did you complete your question?
Yeah. Are there parts in which you think are true, or are there parts in which you can accept?
Okay, so the thing is, this is always a very confusing thing, and I get this question a lot. What does it mean to say something is scientifically valid? So let me give you an example. Forget Darwinism for now. The static state model was a valid scientific model. The static state model was a valid scientific model, and it was the prevailing model of the universe. The static state model said the universe is in existence and it always has existed and always will exist. This was a valid scientific model before the 1940s or something, right? However, as a Muslim, would I be able to accept this as literally true? No, because we as Muslims believe the universe had a beginning. Allah created the universe. So this model, I would have accepted as scientifically valid, but I wouldn't have accepted to be true. And if someone asked me, I can give them the answer from Islam or I can give them the answer from the philosophy of science. This static state model turned out to be false, and a new model came up, which was known as the Big Bang model. Now the Big Bang model, I'm not a cosmologist, but what I have heard some physicists and others say is it posits like a beginning of the universe. Others disagree, but so it's more in line with Islam than say the static state model. I, as a Muslim, I'll accept that as scientifically valid. But again, I will not accept it to be literally true, because that's not what science can do. 100 years from now, the Big Bang model may be replaced by another model. So when we say we accept it to be scientifically valid, what we're saying is, it's not true, we're just simply accepting it's a working model. Now what's important to understand is you don't have to be a Muslim to make that exception. Even if you happen to be an atheist, even if you happen to be a Jew or Christian or whatever, there's no incoherency in accepting Darwinism as a valid theory, but at the same time saying, I don't believe it to be literally true. There's no incoherency in that. Because science doesn't give you truth. If you believe science gives you truth, then you can say, I believe in certain parts and I don't believe in certain parts, and I don't believe it to be valid or whatever. But if you just go with, it's just a valid scientific theory, you can accept it as a valid scientific theory, but you don't have to say it's true. Now what some Muslims do, I've heard some prominent Muslim speakers do is they say this part of evolutionary theory, if it was true literally, we can accept, these other parts we can't. So they do that. I'm not going to take names, but some speakers do that. I don't like that approach. I don't think it's needed. I think it's enough for us to say it's scientifically valid and we don't have to be accepted to be literally true because of the philosophy of science, right? And Allah Himself says in the Qur'an, I didn't make you witnesses to your creation or to the creation of the heavens and the earth. So when certain Muslims say, well, certain models of the universe, they are in the Qur'an or they are in line with the Qur'an, and there's certain evolutionary things which are in line with the Qur'an, other things not so, I just think there's no need to go that far. It's enough to just say, science is ilm al-dhann, it's the knowledge of speculation, and we know the Qur'an to be literally true. There's no reason to cross-pollinate. It's enough for us to say it's scientifically valid, but it's not literally true, and just leave it there. Does that make sense? Yes.
Expanding on what you're saying, do you not think because this topic can be a big crisis for some Muslims, saying, because I've heard in England as well, that we can accept Darwinism and evolution up until the point of view, Islam and what they call considered opinions. Do you not think that in some cases it's acceptable to say this because there's a need, because there's such an issue with Islamism?
I'll tell you why I don't think it's a good idea. Because it's a methodological problem. So what's happening here is this. Science is true. What are we going to do? Let's panic. Okay, this is in line with the Quran, this is not in line with the Quran. What if tomorrow another scientific theory in chemistry comes or something else comes which says there's no soul? Definitively there's no soul. Whatever, yeah? What are we going to do then? Oh, when Allah mentions the soul, there may be a metaphor. We don't want to do that. The whole problem here is the reason why some Muslims have that crisis is because they don't understand the science and they don't understand the philosophy of science. I deal with this topic day and night, and one consistent pattern which I've seen, I have never seen somebody who's doubting Islam who actually understands evolutionary biology and philosophy of science properly. I've never seen that. What I have seen, and I'm not saying it's not possible, it may be possible, but somebody doubting Islam because of evolutionary biology and they understand it and the science behind it, it's usually the case of people who know the least. Most of my things which I get about, I'm confused, are from people who don't have a background in this at all. Or, there's a distinction I've also seen, they've done a little bit of medical science, but they haven't done evolutionary science, because remember there's a difference between the two. As a doctor, you just do the science, yeah? You don't do the philosophy of the science or the evolutionary thinking. This problem also has another dimension, which is the scientism aspect. We've been affected by scientism. If something doesn't make sense scientifically, it's not true. If there's something in the Quran which seems unscientific, the Quran, we have to change it. The fact of the matter is this, there are things in the Quran which scientifically make no sense and never will. The virgin birth. How does that make sense scientifically? It doesn't. It's a miracle from Allah. How does the parting of the sea make sense scientifically? It doesn't. How does it make sense that, for example, the Prophet ﷺ, he went to heaven and he came back the same day and he went to Jerusalem the same night, scientifically? Someone can try and come up with something about, string theory in 11 dimensions. That's all nonsense. It's all nonsense. We don't need that, yeah? We have independent reasons why the Quran is true. Remember, everybody in their paradigm, they begin off with one foundational truth, if not more. At least one foundational truth, which is unquestionable. If you keep asking the question why, forever, you'll never have any knowledge. This is well known because you have infinite regress. It just keeps going back. How do you know? How do you know? How do you know? Our foundation starts at the fitrah. And that's if you're a non-Muslim, right? But if you're a Muslim, we know Islam is our foundation. It's the religion of the fitrah. We have independent reasons why it is the truth, right? Anything which comes from the history. There may be a historian which will say, there is no evidence for Moses. There may be a scientist who says, well, if you look at the soul, it doesn't really make any sense. Whatever nonsense comes from someone else which contradicts the Quran, right? We will reject. Whatever comes which is in line with the Quran, we don't have to accept. We will say Allah knows best. Yeah? But for us, the foundational truth is the Qur'an. There's a book up there. I forgot the name of the book, but before the lecture I was reading it. I was just flicking through it. Aqidah Tahwiyah and I think the explanation was done by Ibn Taymiyyah. I just happened to open it up on a page, and the Shaykh says that this is the people that he's talking about how long ago? Like almost 1,000 years ago, whatever. They would use their aql, their reasoning, over revelation. They say, this doesn't make any sense. I'm not going to accept this because it doesn't make any sense. But the fact of the matter is, if you know something to be true, using your aql and even through your fitrah, Allah may tell you things which doesn't make sense. But just because it doesn't make sense doesn't mean it's not true. 500 years ago, if I get a really intelligent guy, 500 years ago, a scientist, and I tell him in the future, you're going to have kids that are going to be talking to each other from down the street, but connected via satellite. We're going to have this invisible thing called Wi-Fi. We're going to have this, we're going to have that. He's going to think I'm speaking about magic. He's going to find this impossible. But it's true. Because according to his limited mind, he cannot fathom Wi-Fi, electricity, internet. He can't understand these things. His knowledge is limited. So when Allah tells us something which logically doesn't seem that it's making sense, it doesn't mean it's not true. The only question we need to ask, which is valid, how do we know Islam is true? That's a valid question. Yeah? That question, if you show somebody why Islam is true, everything else is irrelevant. There may be a historian who says, well, the Qur'an, and there are historians like this, they'll come up with stuff like Muhammad ﷺ didn't exist. They have this hypothesis, yeah? He didn't exist. Makkah didn't exist. It was actually Bakka in another city in Jordan, whatever. Yeah. Some other guy might say Darwinism is true because of this, whatever. Fact of the matter is, our foundation is the Quran for logical reasons and also because it's in line with our fitrah. Once we establish that, everything else doesn't matter anymore. And this is why one of the big mistakes which is made by du'at is that they give da'wah using a bit of philosophy of science, using a bit of science, but they're not building the foundation of the Quran. And this is the same problem we have when we speak to Christians. When we speak to Christians, we don't tell them why Islam is true, we tell them why the Bible is wrong. And what that does is that Christian, rather than becoming Muslim, they sometimes become atheist. I met a Christian recently, 2 years ago. I asked him, an atheist. I asked him, why did you become a Christian? He said, a Muslim showed me the Bible is not true. How the hell is that an achievement? You made a Christian who's closer to us, as Allah says, they're closer to believe than the Christians, to become an atheist. Because the way we give da'wah is we don't give da'wah using the Quran, we give da'wah using kalam. Yeah, just a bit of philosophy about this, a bit of that. The fact of the matter is we got to give da'wah using the Quran, build the foundation, show them why Islam is true. This lecture obviously didn't include the Quran or why the Quran is true, because that's we can do separately. But you got to build people's foundations.